A reading from Luke 21 from verse 25. Jesus said, "And there will be signs in sun and moon and stars, and on the earth distress of nations in perplexity, because of the roaring of the sea and the waves, people fainting with fear and with foreboding of what is coming on the world. For the powers of the heavens will be shaken. And then they will see the Son of Man coming in a cloud with power and great glory. Now when these things begin to take place, straighten up and raise your heads, because your redemption is drawing near." And he told them a parable. "Look at the fig tree and all the trees. As soon as they come out in leaf, you see for yourselves and know that the summer is already near. So also, when you see these things taking place, you know that the kingdom of God is near. Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all has taken place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. But watch yourselves, lest your hearts be weighed down with dissipation and drunkenness and cares of this life, and that day come upon you suddenly like a trap. For it will come upon all who dwell on the face of the whole earth. But stay awake at all times, praying that you may have strength to escape all these things that are going to take place, and to stand before the Son of Man." Now, I think it's fair to say that this is pretty strong stuff from Jesus. This is Jesus using apocalyptic language and speaking of great catastrophes and ultimately, of course, of his own return. The Son of Man, he says, coming in a cloud with power and great glory. This is apocalyptic language. This is a warning that these things are near, that these things are about to take place. And in that context, Jesus uses perhaps one of the trickiest verses in the New Testament. "Truly," he says, "I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all has taken place." And this is the problem. That generation, those who were with Jesus, those apostles, those disciples with him, have passed away, because Jesus spoke this almost 2,000 years ago. We know that they are dead, and they died before the Son of Man came in a cloud with power and great glory. And in fact, even now, Jesus has not come on a cloud with power and great glory. And this is awkward, because it raises this question: can Jesus' predictions be trusted? Because let's be honest, this simply did not come true. Now, there are many who say, well, yes, sometimes Jesus did get things wrong. Yes, Jesus' predictions can't be trusted. And some simply accept the facts. They say that, well, Jesus makes mistakes. He's mostly trusted, but he's not entirely to be trusted. But that, you see, raises more questions. How do we decide what is right or what is wrong? All this business Jesus talks about God being love. Well, was that right or was that wrong? How do we decide? How do we know? How do we sit in judgment? How do we know what we can trust of Jesus if he makes mistakes? But there's more than just that. There's a passage in Deuteronomy dealing with false prophets, which I'm afraid leads to their condemnation, that they may be put to death. I'll read it to you. "But the prophet who presumes to speak a word in my name that I have not commanded him to speak, or who speaks in the name of other gods, that same prophet shall die. And if you say in your heart, how may we know the word that the Lord has not spoken? When a prophet speaks in the name of the Lord, if the word does not come to pass or come true, that is a word that the Lord has not spoken. The prophet has spoken it presumptuously. You need not be afraid of him." So here's the thing. If Jesus speaks words and they don't come true, they're not of God. And Jesus is speaking as if these things come from God, but they're not of God, so he is speaking presumptuously. He is, in the eyes of Deuteronomy, worthy of death. Are we to believe that we have a presumptuous Jesus? Are we to believe that we have a Jesus who's more worthy of death than worship? Does he speak for God or not? No, you see, the problem is to shrug your shoulders and simply to say that Jesus sometimes gets things wrong is to render Jesus null and void. It's to reject the notion that Jesus is God. And it's to reject the notion that he's a trustworthy teacher. He's a teacher who gets things wrong. He's a teacher who teaches falsely. He's a teacher who sins. And of course, a Christ who sins is a Christ who cannot die on our account. And in the end, you reject the faith which is built upon Christ. You can't really go down that route because it leads you in the end, and logically, you have to say, to very dark places. So what do? Well, you look again at the text. You look at it more closely, because we all have a tendency when we're reading the Bible to read what we think is there rather than perhaps paying attention to what is actually there. Because we're familiar and we come to pay only half attention when we read, and therefore we come away with only half the text. And this passage is a case in point, because there's two separate parts of the passage. There's the apocalyptic language, the Son of Man coming, etc. And then there's a parable about the fig tree. They address a similar point, the theme of the chapter, but they make separate points, and they are there for separate reasons, and they refer to different things. The first section speaks about the return of Christ. The second is a parable about readiness, which is related to the context. We'll come back to the context in a second. And we know there's a separation because Luke introduces the parable, and he told them a parable, which suggests that there's a break in Jesus' discourse. And here's the thing. That context I mentioned, the rest of chapter 21, is important because just prior to this passage, Jesus is foretelling the destruction of the temple. And then he goes on to speak of his return. Temple first, then return. The two are separate. And the parable that Jesus speaks is a parable about the fall of the temple. That's why there's a slight change in focus and subject. And he told them a parable. That's why in verse 32 he speaks of this generation, those who are stood around him. Because in AD 70, not even 4 decades after Jesus spoke this, the temple was indeed destroyed by the Romans. And so Jesus is indeed no false prophet. But in all of this discussion, we mustn't lose the focus of the passage as a whole. It's a warning to be watchful and to be ready. Don't put off your spiritual life to tomorrow or a future time or when I'm older. It's for later on in life. No, Jesus says, stay awake at all times and allow the faith to soak into every area of your life. You may be concerned about this. You may be fearful even when you read things like this. You may be fearful when you look around at what's going on in the rest of the world. But the message of the passage is stay awake, be watchful, but be comforted because Christ is near. So in all of this, yes, read the passage carefully. Yes, see that Jesus' words do in fact come true. But don't miss the main thrust, which is stay awake. Don't put it off. Stay awake and act in faith now.